Agad Cúirlig and Minister, welcome to the Chamber and congratulations. And I want to support this bill. I think it is necessary to address the challenges of hate crime and incitement to hatred in Ireland. But there are some concerns, and they have been reflected by colleagues already, and indeed some of them Senator Clonan spoke about. And our opportunity here at second stage is this is the opportunity during a piece of legislation to talk about the general principles of legislation and its objectives and what we think is important in the general principles where we can improve this bill so that we can better the lot of all of our citizens. And in many ways this bill represents one of the most fundamental challenges of our age, how we balance two competing sets of rights. So on the one hand, we have the right of freedom of expression, the right to free speech, and indeed, as Senator Clonan had said, the right to challenge, the right to hold controversial opinions. And on the other, we have the right of the individual not to be targeted because of their identity or their perceived identity. In many ways, I think it is sad that we have to have this kind of debate, that hate crime and hate speech, which is very much a real thing, that it exists in Ireland. And indeed, I would much prefer that we would be talking as a society about how we can look at including people to a far greater extent and about how we can recognise them. And while love is the opposite of hate, and while it's impossible to promote love speech, I think it is very important within our society that we do much more to recognise those who do promote tolerance and inclusivity in our communities and our country. And I think it would do us much better to look at how we can, as legislators, seek to break down some of those barriers and indeed perceived barriers. And if anything, I think our experience with regard to the north of Ireland and those barriers teaches us more than ever before why that is important. Indeed, I know colleagues said that we can't legislate for kindness in the earlier stage debate, but it was unusual, even though I read all of the debate for last week and followed most of the contributions. It's interesting, the word love was not used in a single contribution during all this. Indeed, if we are to have legislation to promote kindness, there are those Christian tenets, love one another as I have loved you, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I sometimes get concerned that we don't focus enough on promoting positive behaviours. But that said, we obviously do need to tackle what this legislation seeks to achieve. And why do we need to do it? Well, Minister, I just came from the Oireachtas Sports Committee, of which I'm a member, where we had a discussion around inclusion in sport. And there we heard from different groups about how even in the sporting field, they're subject to racist and homophobic and targeted abuse. And that's not just in terms of verbal abuse, but it's in terms of signs being displayed at sporting grounds, and more invidious in many ways is the campaign of online abuse that tends to follow on. And the Oireachtas Committee on Sport, as you may know, carried out a report. We published a report where one of the recommendations was that where there is not by national governing bodies positive codes of behaviour promoted, and where some of this abuse in sport is not tackled, then there would be implications for the funding of those sporting bodies. And I'm glad to say that all the national governing bodies are on board on this. And I use a very specific example in this House of Lee Chin, who is an outstanding Wexford sportsman. But not just that, he's a role model within communities. He suffered horrific abuse and continues to suffer it. And we saw it only recently at a charity match, of all things, when Wexford were playing Tipperary. And I was glad that the GAA, and this wasn't the state, but that it was the GAA that took strong action against those who are perpetrating that abuse. Because it's not just the impact that it had on Lee Chin, the impact that that had on those from minorities who want to play sport, and when they see that, it's highly impactful. I've personally experienced homophobic abuse. I've witnessed homophobic and racist abuse against friends of mine. I have had friends who have been physically attacked because of their sexuality or their race, or indeed their perceived sexuality. And they know it because of the language that's used when they're attacked. So the reality is this is something that is happening on the ground. And the question is, how much should we tolerate before we as a state decide we've got to step back? And I'm one who advocates very strongly for freedom of expression. But I think questions do need to be asked as to where we look to draw the line. And I want to raise, because I know a lot of people here talk about general speech in the media and so on, but I want to talk, apart from journalists, I want to talk about artists. And artists, by their nature, need to be controversial, they need to be challenging, they sometimes can even be offensive. And they have a right to be offensive. And in many cases, often some of that abuse is in the religious sphere. So I want to just use an example, and this is where we might think about how this legislation would come out in practice. Because, you know, for something to be an offence, it's not just that the act is created, that there has to be the intention behind it. So I think of, for instance, and you'll recall this, where Charlie Hebdo, the satirical magazine in France, decided to post particular cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad. This was deemed to be deeply offensive to those of the Muslim faith. The question would there arise is it a case that the intention of those cartoonists was to engage in what might be classified as hate speech? Could they then be prosecuted on the basis for publishing that? How would we determine their intention in those circumstances? And equally then, when those, and people remember the horrific attacks and the murders that took place of those cartoonists and those journalists, would it be considered an aggravating factor in the prosecutions of those who then carried out those murders, that they carried it out on the basis? And I'm not certain I have the answer, but I think that what we do need to do in legislation is we need to be very clear as to what what the answer is and what the purpose is. And I make the same view, by the way, that when we come to those of Christian beliefs, because many people take a grave offence to when artists, for instance, depict Christ in a particular manner. And in those circumstances, we have to know for certain that if Christians are being discriminated against, you know, what is the motivation behind that? Is that motivation purely of an artist expressing something, or is it motivated by hatred of religion and of Christians? And in what circumstances then we proceed to prosecute? I think also one of the important things is, and what we all use is language, and I think we've also got to understand language and the use of words. And the use of words and language change over time and in cultural contexts. So I speak as a gay man. The word queer was traditionally used as a pejorative term, whereas in many cases now, the gay community has taken ownership of the word queer. The N-word, which I won't use in this house, is predominantly used as a negative term against people of colour. Yet many people of colour, who are musicians and others, have taken control of that word and have used it. So the circumstances in which language is used also needs to be carried out. Interestingly, and I will use the word because I read Senator Flynn's speech because of the dispute around the word knacker, in inverted commas, and the word knackered. And I had an Australian friend who was here in Leinster House who couldn't understand the fuss. It's used in slang in Australia on a regular basis, but most of those phrases came originally from Ireland, but it doesn't have the same context there. So the question will also have to be the context in which particular language is used I believe will need to be understood. Freedom of expression, it's a fundamental right of us as individuals. I must say, though, that I do find it ironic, and Senator Clonan mentioned the large volume of correspondence, you know, on this issue, and I keep a track on, you know, where we get correspondence from the same individuals. I find it ironic that some of the individuals who are arguing most strongly and loudly calling for freedom of expression with regard to this legislation are also calling, at times, for certain books to be banned in some of our schools and libraries. And you can't have it both ways. You can't be looking for freedom of expression on the one side and at the same time looking for books to be banned because they express a view with which you don't agree. On the other hand, you have to have consistency across that.
Sorry, are you referring to appropriate age material?
No, that's not a point of order. Sorry.
Sorry,
thank you.
But I think my point is very valid. You have to be consistent in your point of view. My challenge on this issue is because you're dealing with two competing rights, both of which are exceptionally important rights. I think, though, that we do need to introduce the an aggravated offence when it comes to hatred, because the purpose of laws ultimately must favour the victim. And it is very clear that we have hate crime and hate speech in this country. That said, what is absolutely essential, I think, is that we have certainty when it comes to enforcement. We need to know, and I'm talking again about artists and journalists and others, people who want to be challenging, who are at the very cutting edge, provided that their motivation isn't coming from a place of hate, they need to know what they can do. But again, our test has to be, how do we test that motivation? And we can't read inside their minds. Certainly if somebody stood up on a pulpit or painted a wall and said, all gays must die, or we should kill all Jews, that is a very clear expression of something. My concern, though, Minister, is that there's some areas of the definition here that need to be tightened up, because I think that they are too loose. And I would hope in the context of this debate that we are going to be able to ensure that we have a good piece of legislation that will protect victims. The right to free speech, is not without limits. We all know that. There's the famous American court case, where the judge, Oliver Wendell Holmes, said somebody can't go into an open theatre and just shout fire. There have to be limits at times placed on free speech. But if we are to put those limits in terms of protecting the victim, there has to be certainty. And I am just concerned about some of the definitions. Thank you.